jump right in.
Hi.
Hey there.
Hello, everyone. Because it was such a mad dash to get into the next room, and I will change my name later, but my name is Leilani Iser-Reed. I'm the TL for the Mid-Hudson PGRC. And of course, this is the second session on forgiveness. And we have Michael WOHL, correct?
Yes.
Awesome. So please enjoy. If you have any questions, put your questions in the chat and we will try to do our best to answer the questions. Enjoy. Thank you.
All right. Well, is there anybody in the virtual space here that I see more people are slowly joining in? Is there anybody in the virtual space here who is not around for part one? Feel like
yes, me.
Anyone? Okay, Donna. Okay.
I couldn't get in. I tried to get in at I think it was 3:17 and it looked like it was closed already.
My apologies. I will go over quickly just what is forgiveness from a psychological perspective. What we spent the first while talking about, the first hour, is forgiveness of others. Okay, so what is forgiveness? What are some of the factors that facilitate the forgiveness process? Why is forgiveness of others a good thing for our health and well-being, including addictive behavior? In this hour, we are going to be spending some time discussing self-forgiveness. And before we jump into that, and my apologies, Donna, are there any lingering questions from the first hour about forgiveness? And if there are any lingering questions, this may help Donna catch up a little bit. And again, for Donna, for your sake, I've got a 2-screen setup, and everybody's at the chat box and everybody's little tiles, the Brady Bunch board, is on my second monitor. So every once in a while, I'm going to scan over. I'm not ignoring you. I'm actually looking at you. So are there any questions or concerns based on the first hour? I answered everybody's question. That's awesome. That's awesome. Okay. So without further ado, let's turn our attention to self-forgiveness. Okay. Who hasn't committed an act that they later beat themselves up about? Right? Where they think, oh, why did I do that? Why am I engaging in that behavior? Why did I hurt that person I didn't mean to? Or maybe you did mean to and then later regretted doing so, right? You had second thoughts and you're like, oh, I really shouldn't have sought revenge or something like that, okay? But what is self-forgiveness? Okay, it's important to first review the definition. So Valerie, before I jump into this, Valerie had a question.
Yes, it just occurred to me when you started talking about forgiveness of self. The thought just crossed my mind. I wonder, is he going to use the same set of tools for self as he recommended for others?
Yeah, so that's a really good question, and we will go through sort of the benefits and drawbacks of self-forgiveness. And so I think you're foreshadowing, 2 slides ahead here. So thanks, Valerie, that yes, some of the same tools can be used. In fact, almost all of them. The bigger question that we're going to be talking about today in this hour is what's the benefit of self-forgiveness, right? And when might self-forgiveness be a bad thing? and particularly within the context of engaging in addictive behavior. Okay, but first let's review the definition of forgiveness. Okay, so remember, it's first better. I want to reiterate what forgiveness is not, because I think it's particularly relevant in terms of self-forgiveness. It's not pardoning, remember, because pardoning is washing away the event, right? Or the hurt. It's not condoning, because it's saying that the transgression was okay to commit. It's not excusing, because that's saying that there was a good reason for committing that transgression. It's not forgetting, because that implies a memory loss. And it's not denying, because that is suggesting a reluctance to see the transgression, the behavior, as being harmful. What is forgiveness? Well, my easy definition of forgiveness, working definition of forgiveness, that I will ask all of you to apply here today, is that it's no longer holding negative thoughts or feelings towards another person for past wrongdoings, and that includes the self. Okay, so what is self-forgiveness? It's basically the same as forgiveness, but the target is different. The target is the self as opposed to someone else. What separates forgiveness of others from the self is that you are not grappling with another human being's understanding of the event. You don't have to worry about somebody else's rich internal world and what they're thinking and whether or not they are truly remorseful. You only have to worry about what's going on inside your own head. Now, that's sometimes easier said than done, right? That we're often grappling with internal understandings of events. We're not quite sure. Events might be ambiguous to us, even though we're the ones who committed the offense, which includes we're grappling with issues of personal responsibility and personal guilt. Okay, and so Connie said, is forgiving oneself harder than forgiving others? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. Okay, and sometimes it's reciprocal, right? Especially within the context of addictive behaviors, where if the transgression is the addictive behavior, you're harming yourself as well as harming others, and how that ends up, the interplay between the two of those. Okay, and we'll be discussing that. But what is important to start off with here, okay, is that colloquial, I always have trouble with that word, colloquial understandings of self-forgiveness tend to suggest that self-forgiveness is wholly a good thing, okay? And that it is something that everybody should be seeking to do. Everybody should be forgiving themselves. Even Dalai Lama has weighed into this, okay? We can never make peace in the outer world until we make peace with ourselves, okay? Is this the case? I started doing research on self-forgiveness in the late 2000s. And there was at the time very little research on this type of forgiveness. In fact, it was labeled the forgotten stepchild of the forgiveness literature. Okay, there wasn't a whole heck of a lot of research on self-forgiveness, but this has changed dramatically since. There is now quite a bit of research on the causes and consequences of self-forgiveness. And I'm going to be walking you through some of this research over the next 50 minutes. I'm going to try to make sure that I have some time left over at the end for just a roundtable discussion, including stuff covered in the first session. So what was known and is known is that self-blame is high in situations where we recognize that we have committed an illegitimate harm towards the self, okay? We also know that self-blame can result in a ruminative loop. So you keep thinking about, right? You keep thinking about the event and flogging the self, right? So you accept blame, and you keep thinking about the event. And in fact, the blame can get worse and worse and worse through this ruminative loop that can lead to anxiety and depression. And we wondered whether self-forgiveness could break that self-blame depression cycle. So let's take a situation that I'm sure that many of us, if not all of us, have experienced, that we end up beating ourselves up about. And that is the unwanted end to a romantic relationship. That is somebody breaking up with us, right? And we want to remain in that relationship, but that other person does not. This can send people into a tailspin, resulting in a great deal of self-blame. We may ruminate on the things that we did wrong and may even fall into a depression, okay? We argued that one way out might be to forgive the self, to engage in self-forgiveness. And we tested this idea in a sample of people who had recently experienced this. So we recruited people who had recently been broken up with, who wanted to remain in that relationship. Okay. And what we found is, as we expected, based on the existing literature, is that self-blame increases depression. And we want to know whether the relation between self-blame and forgiveness. What we found is, again, as predicted, the more you self-blame, the less likely you are to self-forgive. But importantly, also, as we predicted, self-forgiveness reduces depression. Okay. So if we can find some way to perhaps increase self-forgiveness, we can reduce negative psychological and physiological health outcomes. But first and foremost, let's be clear here. I'm not saying that people should work towards not accepting responsibility and thus, not self-blaming, when in fact they are responsible for the harm done. The worst thing that you can do is cognitively reframe the situation to be one in which you abdicate responsibility when you have responsibility. Okay. Because by doing so, if you abdicate responsibility, you will not grow. Okay. You also don't want to be engaging in an endless loop of rumination, because this is going to be leading to depression. Instead, the best way to move forward is to take a step back and take stock. So let's take this, unwanted end to a relationship as being the situation at hand. You will want to, if you want to be a better partner for somebody moving forward, you want to be thinking to yourself, what did I do wrong? What did I do wrong in that relationship? And what can I do better? How can I be a better human being for the next relationship? Okay. It's through that growth that you can find self-acceptance and self-forgiveness. Okay. So including things like addictive behavior. Maybe it was the addictive behavior that made that person leave the relationship. And you don't want to say, well, I'm not to blame. she or he's to blame, you want to take stock. Oh, wait a second, maybe I need to get my house in order. Okay. And then once you've done that, then maybe you can work towards that self-forgiveness. And we'll get into that a little bit deeper later. Another transgression we often commit against the self involves procrastination. Okay. For example, most people living with addiction understand the harm that they're inflicting on themselves as well as others. However, for an assortment of reasons, they procrastinate on changing their behavior. Okay. What is procrastination? It's a failure of self-regulation, a needless delay in a particular discrete action, okay? A self-harming action, a transgression against the self. And thus, self-forgiveness may be pertinent here, okay? Self-forgiveness helps replace an avoidance motivation with an approach motivation, okay? So if you're not forgiving yourself, you may be trying to avoid, right, what you did. Once you start self-forgiving, then you can maybe start approaching it, including behavior change. And so again, one of the first forays we did into this is, can self-forgiveness stop procrastination for unhealthy, unproductive behavior? And so the first thing we wanted to do is to say, okay, well, I work at a university. What is something that that students procrastinate about quite a bit? Okay, and that's studying. Okay, which can lead to a harmful outcome, bad grades. Okay, so what we wanted to do is to see if self-forgiveness could decrease procrastination, and if then that decreased procrastination then improved grades. So what we did is we got permission from our ethics committee that just before students in a particular classroom were about to write their first midterm, we gave them a survey, okay? And we asked them the extent to which they procrastinated on studying for that particular midterm. And we also asked them about their grade. So if we could get their grades for the purpose of this research afterwards. So permission to ask the instructor to give us their grades. And then we assessed them again on procrastination just prior to the second midterm. And then we got their grade. What we found here is that self-forgiveness tended to decrease procrastination on the next exam. So if you forgave yourself for procrastinating on studying for the first exam, you're less likely to procrastinate on studying for the next exam. Okay. Now, why did self-forgiveness work? Because it seemed to decrease the negative emotions related to the procrastination. So what we found is that when students did not forgive themselves for procrastinating, they were beating themselves up just before the exam. And so that ended up leading to poor grades. But the people who were able to let go of the fact that they procrastinated, that reduced the negative emotions that they were experiencing while writing the exam. It not only reduced the negative emotions for writing the exam and ended up influencing grades, it also decreased procrastination on the next exam, which ended up positively influencing their grades. Okay, does that make sense? Okay, so let's talk a little bit about, perhaps this is why many therapies have focused on increasing self-forgiveness, especially for addictive behavior. Okay, let's move away from studying and back to addictive behavior and the relation between forgiving the self, okay, and forgiving others during addiction treatment. Okay, so in a longitudinal panel study, individuals who are living with an alcohol dependency were followed for 30 months. Respondents were assessed in person every 6 months for their drinking and other psychological indicators, and respondents were reimbursed for the assessment. What they found is that at the beginning of treatment, people were more likely to forgive others for the pain that they said led in part to the addictive behavior. So the trauma that others inflicted on them that led in part to the addictive behavior. So they were more forgiving of others than forgiving the self for their addictive behavior. And the harm that was caused to the self and others as a result of the addictive behavior. Now, the rate of increase in forgiveness of the self was double that of forgiveness of others throughout the course of that 30 months. So forgiveness of the self tended to increase at a greater rate than forgiveness of others. And this suggests that achievement of a stable recovery is a gradual and dynamic and ongoing process. It's interesting to contrast the change in addictive behavior during treatment, which is mostly concentrated in that first 6 months and then is more stable thereafter. Okay. Among people who are addressing their alcohol use disorder by stopping and reducing their drinking and forgiveness increasing, what we find is that there tends to be an influence between forgiveness of the self and forgiveness of other. Okay, where what we see is that the more that people are likely to forgive others, that tends to predict a forgiveness of the self over time. And then as you forgive the self more over time, it tends to have a reciprocal effect on forgiveness of others. Okay, hopefully that was clear. Now, so far we've been seeing that forgiveness is a good thing. Okay, now what might be some self-forgiving strategies in addiction treatment? Number one, being deliberate about forgiving yourself and others. So being active in that process, thinking about the forgiveness process. Stop empowering others by remaining a victim seems to be really important. Recognizing that forgiveness matters for addiction recovery and using that knowledge, that forgiveness really is important. Okay. Don't bottle up your feelings. That tends to lead to, again, a ruminative loop. And don't take your hurt out on innocent people. Okay. Look at the time. All right. Now, very briefly, I want to talk about perceived forgiveness of others. Okay. I've been talking about forgiving others. When I was doing some searching for this talk here today and talking about the nature of forgiveness with my lab, one of the things that we found really interesting is that the literature is devoid of research on the extent to which people believe that others in their life are forgiving of them for their addictive behavior. Now, remember, when somebody engages in addictive behavior, not only harming the self, but you're also harming friends and family and society at large. In fact, there's a growing literature showing that the great amount of harm that is inflicted on others as a result of addictive behavior. But there's nothing on the perception that others are forgiving of you. Why might this be important? Because social support is important for the recovery process. Okay, so friends can help the recovery process. Partners can help the recovery process. Society can help the recovery process. And one of the things, but what's important to know about the social support literature is that, again, you might have social support, but not perceive that you have social support. Okay, so if you recall at the beginning of last hour, I said, in psychology, we're not necessarily interested in reality. We're interested in people's perceptions of reality. And it's people's perceptions of reality that seem to be what drives people's attitudes and behaviors. Okay, so what we're going to be doing, and tune back in, maybe in a couple of months, we are just about to start a study where we are going to examine people's perceptions of whether others in their life are forgiving of the harms that have been committed as a result of their addictive behavior, and whether or not that relates to perceptions of social support. Because we know that perceptions of social support end up facilitating behavior change. Okay, so I just wanted to drop that little tidbit of information, getting you thinking about perceptions of social support, perceptions of others' forgiveness, and how that might lead to the self-forgiveness, might relate to the self-forgiveness process. But overall, for the last half hour or so, what I've been hammering home here is that both forgiveness and self-forgiveness appear to have positive effects. Okay, you can think of it as sort of the regular maintenance that keeps us on the road to health and well-being and the recovery process. But just like cars, things can break down, right? And are there times where forgiveness might actually facilitate that breakdown? Okay. Are there times where forgiveness can be a bad thing? Specifically, I'll talk about self-forgiveness. I have spent quite a bit of time, and I'll be showing you some results shortly, on the dark side of forgiveness of others and the self. Okay. I was really bothered by the academic literature and the theological literature where that tends to frame forgiveness as, puts it on high on a pedestal of this is something that everybody should be doing and trying to achieve. Okay, self-forgiveness and other forgiveness. And I said, is forgiveness and self-forgiveness always a good thing? Let's take a moment to digest this, especially since I've been priming you over the past hour and a half to think that forgiveness is the greatest thing since sliced bread. Okay. Now, there have been research outside of my lab that found that 88% of people felt that forgiveness could ultimately be costly for the forgiver in some contexts. Specifically, for example, abusive relationships. Okay. So if you're continually forgiving the abuser, then that seems to facilitate, it keeps perpetuating the abusive, the abuse in the abusive relationship. And 66% could recall at least one episode where their act of forgiveness yielded negative results and transgression, repeated transgression. A recent longitudinal study of newlywed couples found that spouses who expressed forgiveness were more readily experienced steady rates of psychological and physical aggression from their partners over a 4-year period, whereas less forgiving spouses experienced a decrease in aggression. It seems as though, I think I have points here. Okay. It seems as though partners who know that so people who know that their partners are high in forgiveness, okay, that they take advantage of those people. They take advantage of the fact that they tend to be forgiving, okay? there's also a growing body of research that suggests that individuals are more likely to act unethically after acting in an ethical manner. And that is called moral licensing. Okay, so people tend to believe that when they act, so if say they donate to their local religious establishment, okay, donate money or time, we actually see that they're more likely to engage in unethical behaviors thereafterwards, okay? Because that ethical behavior gives them a license, a moral license to behave badly. And my recently graduated master's student, Alex McCaffrey, and my colleague, Gabriel Adams at Virginia Commonwealth, we just finished conducting a number of studies where we show that people who express forgiveness, okay, that they are forgiving of a transgressor, are more likely to transgress themselves later on. Okay, so particularly in this particular study, it was in a work context, and we gave them a scenario and asked them to imagine that a colleague had committed something really bad against them, and then whether or not they would forgive. And then later on in the survey, we asked people, you know, their willingness to like steal a stapler from work, or call in late, or not come to work and say that they're sick when they're not actually sick, so playing hooky. And we found that the more that people expressed forgiveness of the transgressor at work earlier on, the more likely they were to report that willingness to engage in unmoral behaviors or unethical behaviors later on. And, you know, for this audience, I think what's particularly important is that self-forgiveness is potentially maladaptive for chronic unhealthy behaviors or addictive behaviors. To foreshadow the results of the studies that I'm going to be presenting to you is that there seems to be a difference between forgiving of ongoing negative behaviors and forgiveness when those negative, unhealthy, chronic behaviors or abusive behaviors end. Okay, so if it's a discrete event, if it's already happened, if it's in the past, forgiveness, likely a good thing. We argued in my lab, and I'll be showing you data suggesting that forgiving when the behavior is ongoing might be a bad thing. Okay, so chronic unhealthy behavior. Listen, behavior change is hard. How many of you have made a New Year's resolution or plan to make one in a little while? About 40 to 50% of people tend to make New Year's resolutions, but most people don't keep them. Okay, so only about 19% of resolvers have maintained their New Year's resolution 2 years out. Okay, so it is really, really hard to change your behavior. In terms of addictive behaviors, some studies have found that only about 1% of people seek treatment for their addictive behavior, and only about 15% of people engage in sustained behavior change. Okay, self-forgiveness of unhealthy behaviors like addictive behaviors might help maintain the status quo. Okay, so before I present, the first bit of data here, I think it's important to first understand stages of change. Okay, probably the gold standard stage of change model is what's called the trans-theoretical model of behavioral change. That is, people go through stages. There's pre-contemplation where they're not thinking about change at all. Then they move into contemplation where they're thinking about, they're aware that a problem exists. They're thinking about it, but there's no commitment to take action. Then preparation, where they intend to take action. They're preparing themselves to take action, and then they take action. okay? And some people, there's argument about whether or not there's actually maintenance, or whether people are just constantly in action, okay? But eventually, some people may relapse and then start the circle again. Now, one of the things that motivates, okay, motivation to change is a function of the balance between the pros of continuing the unhealthy behavior and the cons of continuing that behavior. Now, interestingly, although there's a lot of agreement about that, as you move through the stages, okay, there's more cons than pros, okay? So there's more cons of continuing the behavior than pros of continuing the behavior. Not much research has been done on the mechanisms that by which pros and cons that balance, what motivates a change in that balance of pros versus cons. And so we argued that self-forgiveness might be one of those mechanisms. And our first study that we did was on self-forgiveness among smokers. Okay, so we recruited a number of people who smoke. We had them complete a scale, the decisional balance scale, which assessed pros and cons of smoking, the level, the extent to which they forgave themselves for smoking, and their stage of change. Now, remember, these are people who are currently smokers, okay? What we found is that the number of cons relative to pros, and so what this means is that the cons, so when there was more cons of smoking than pros of smoking, that seemed to motivate people to move from the pre-contemplation to the contemplation. And that's a pretty big step, not thinking at all about changing, okay? So to starting to think about their unhealthy behavior. That's a massive step, okay? However, what we see is that there was a decrease in self-forgiveness. And to the extent that people forgave themselves, it demotivated behavior change, okay? So one could think about this as self-forgiveness letting people off the hook for engaging in behavior change. The next foray we had in here with in this line was among gamblers, okay? And we wanted to look at self-forgiveness among disordered gamblers and how it related to behavior change and readiness to change. So we recruited over 300 gamblers. We had them complete a checklist of disordered gambling, self-forgiveness, and readiness to change. Okay, and what the key association that we were looking at is, what is the relation between self-forgiveness and readiness to change? What we found is that the greater the level of disordered gambling, so the pathology, increased readiness to change, which is what we find quite a bit, right? So if you're low in disordered gambling severity, you say, well, there's no reason to change, right? Like I'm not a disordered gambler. But as you see the number of symptoms, people know the problems that their gambling is creating, right? So the more that they see the problems, the more they say, yes, I really need to change this behavior. It's a matter of, do they change the behavior? And remember, behavior change is hard. And what we see is that there's decreased self-forgiveness, okay? So again, there's decreases in self-forgiveness the more that you understand, you see the problems with your behavior. But the critical issue here is that self-forgiveness decreased readiness to change. So to the extent that disordered gamblers are forgiving themselves for engaging in that unhealthy behavior, it's actually demotivating. Okay, they're not changing their behavior. Does that make sense? Any questions before I continue here?
Yeah. When is the time to forgive in recovery?
Yes. So we are getting right there. Okay. So give me a slide. Thank you. It's like you were a plant, Mark. that is in kind of 2 slides. So give me a sec. So what we see here is that readiness to change decreases when people living with addiction self-forgive. This has implications for both treatment as well as recovery. Now, I'm going to answer Mark's question, fast forward through this. I'm going to present a slide that I'm sorry. The next slide is going to be a kind of slide that I tell all of my students never to present because it's incredibly busy. Okay, so I'm going to present it just so you have it for those who want to follow the paths. I apologize to begin with. Apologies, right? Hopefully you forgive me. There was going to have to be one of those lame jokes at one point in this presentation. So I'm going to walk you through the model that my former master's students and I created that directly answers Mark's question. Okay, here we go. And again, apologies. Let me walk through this, especially for people who might be looking at this on their phone. Okay, so maybe just listen to me and don't have your eyes go all googly based on what I'm presenting here. This is just sort of like a path, okay? It's kind of like a decision tree for when is forgiveness a good thing and when is it a bad thing. So at the top is the wrongdoing. And then if we go to the right, okay, it says failure to recognize a wrongdoing. So if you fail to recognize the wrongdoing, there's no basis for self-forgiveness, and that's going to likely create a continuance of the wrongful behavior. Okay, let's put that aside. Let's go to really what's important here, I think, that we're working through is recognition, at least in some sense, of the wrongdoing. So you recognize that you are engaging in an unhealthy behavior, okay? And then let's go to the right. And that is you make a 100% external attribution. You say, I'm engaging in this wrongful behavior, this harmful behavior, but it's because of somebody else. So the reason why I'm engaging in addictive behavior is because of what my dad did to me, what my mom did to me, what my partner did to me. There's a denial of responsibility. Okay, there's no need to self-forgive, right? Because you did not, it's not your fault. And that's likely going to lead to a continuation of the wrongful or harmful behavior. Okay, let's take this situation where there's a combination of internal and external attributions. So you say, yes, I'm engaging in this harmful behavior, but some of it is my fault and some of it is somebody else's fault. Here, the critical factor is, are you accepting the right amount of responsibility? Okay, so if you are not accepting the proper amount of responsibility, again, you're likely going to continue the behavior. Okay, that where self-forgiveness works is that when you accept that you are committing the behavior, the wrongful behavior, and you're accepting the amount of responsibility that is warranted. Okay, the other critical factor that I'll talk about here is that what seems to matter is whether you are still engaging in that behavior. Okay, if you forgive yourself for a behavior that you are still engaged in, it is likely going to lead to a continuance of that behavior. Okay? That if you forgive yourself for ongoing harmful behaviors, you are in part letting yourself off the hook. Self-forgiveness really shows its utility when you have stopped that behavior. Okay? When you are no longer engaging in that behavior and you accept the proper amount of responsibility for engaging in that behavior. Okay? Does that answer your question, Mark, or have I confused more?
No, it was great. Thank you.
Okay. So I want to talk a little bit about some hot off the presses research. And I really mean hot off the presses. I analyzed these data on Monday. And one of the things that we're interested in is the extent to which people identify as being a member of a group that engages in harmful behavior. And what, you know, when I speak to disordered gamblers, and some preliminary data in my lab showed that some gamblers identify themselves as gamblers. So that is part, they see being a gambler, a poker player, as part of their sense of self, right? And so does that undermine behavior change? So part of our sense of self is derived by our membership in a number of social groups, and people can and do identify with unhealthy groups. And some people, what we found, I just got a note saying that I don't have all that much time left, so I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but what we found is, to the extent that gamblers identify themselves as being a gambler, that it's part of who they are, that it's part of their self-definition, that being a poker player is part of their self-definition, that they get social ties, so their friends are also gamblers, right? And that they feel connected to this group, that undermines behavior change. And you can imagine, you know, that for some people, remember we talked about social support, that engaging in behavior change and abstinence might also mean for some of these people ripping themselves out of their friendship group, right? Ripping them away from their social ties, even though they tend to, those social ties end up leading them down a path of continuation of that unhealthy behavior. So with the time I have left, I'm going to try to wrap up and leave some time for questions. Is forgiveness, okay? Forgiveness has tended to be a sacred cow for many, okay? Tutu and others have argued that there's no future without forgiveness. And to some extent, that's true. To a huge extent, that's true. But forgiveness and self-forgiveness are not universally positive. For chronic unhealthy behaviors, forgiveness of others, forgiveness of the self, that it can undermine behavior change. Yes, there may be no future without forgiveness, but forgiveness should only be granted, should not be granted for every infraction, not unless responsibility has been accepted and change has occurred or in the process of occurring, okay? I was going to spend some time, I'll just drop this. A thought question for you before I hit, you know, my last slide is, are there some harms that are simply unforgivable? If what I've been talking to you about today has been interesting to you, I really encourage you to read The Sunflower by Simon Wiesenthal, which grapples with this. In short, this book is two parts. Simon Wiesenthal tells the story, his own biography of when he was in Auschwitz and he was taken on work detail to a hospital where he was taken into a emergency room where an SS officer was on his deathbed and he proceeded to confess everything that he did during the Holocaust, including taking Jews from one town, putting them into the synagogue, lighting it on fire, and when they tried to escape, he shot them. And he asked Simon for his forgiveness. I won't tell you whether or not Simon granted forgiveness or not, but I will say it tormented him so that he ended up, when he was freed from Auschwitz, that he wrote the book and sent the manuscript to theologians, philosophers, politicians, learned folk, to ask whether or not what he did was right. And so there's these little short snippets of people saying, yes, he should have forgiven, no, he should not have forgiven, and why. I really encourage you to read The Sunflower. But I'll end you on these notes, okay? And that is, you may be asking yourself, how can I work towards forgiveness and help others do the same? Number one, model forgiveness. If you're a parent and you want your child to be forgiving, model it. If you want your partner to be more forgiving, model it, okay? That parents who are generally more forgiving, and they tend to have children who are more forgiving, okay? Understand the health and social benefits of forgiveness. In part one, we went through the plethora of ways that forgiving others improves one's mental and physical health. And the same can hold true for self-forgiveness. It can help facilitate behavior change, okay? The third is emotion regulation. Forgiveness can help regulate your emotions, and the more you can regulate your emotions, the more likely you are to forgive. So cognitive reframing, how maybe teaching people, how else can you see this transgression or the transgressor? Can you see forgiveness as a challenge as opposed to a threat? Okay. Know about the actor-observer bias, okay? So that is when somebody harms me, right? Where are our eyes pointed? They're pointed towards the transgressor. So we tend to make a dispositional attribution. We tend to see the transgressor as being somebody who is bad, maybe having malicious intent, because our eyes are focused there. Whereas the transgressor, eyes are focused elsewhere, looking at the situation, the context, embedding their behavior in the larger situation, and understanding that how I'm viewing the transgressor and the transgression, and how the transgressor is viewing the transgression might be a little bit different. And so one way that this can be facilitated is through perhaps perspective taking. Okay, seeing the transgression, see it through a bird's eye view. So in trying to get people to not see the transgression perhaps through their own eyes, but the human mind is wonderful. We can take ourselves outside of ourselves, right? We can look at our past, try to see it through our own eyes, but we can also think about ourselves as a fly in the wall, looking at the situation. And when you can do that, when you can see the transgression through a bird's eye view, then all of a sudden you can start taking this, it's easier to take the situation into account. And currently myself and Ethan Cross, who I mentioned, wrote the book Chatter, again, another book that I urge you to read. We're currently looking at how taking a bird's eye view facilitates the forgiveness process and behavior change. Okay. I'll skip that. The last thing I'll mention is be truthful to yourself that there are limits to the forgiveness process, okay? At the end of the day, whether or not you forgive is a choice. You have the decision whether it is right or wrong for you. Not for the transgressor, okay? Not for others in your life. You need to decide whether or not it's right for you. Forgiveness can be a moral decision, okay? But forgiveness comes with real world consequences. Some good, perhaps some bad. I hope that through this last hour and 2 hours, if you've been with me for the last 2 hours, that I've given you sufficient enough information to make an informed decision about whether forgiveness is right for you. And thank you so much for your time and coming here today.
Thank you, thank you, thank you so much. This was an excellent 2 hours, an excellent presentation on forgiveness. We do have our next presenter coming right up. Please stay on. It will be Recent Problem Gambling Recoveries Find Their Passion, and the presenter will be Mr. Brian Hatch. So we truly appreciate you still sticking with us in this 2-day conference. And again, thank you, Michael, for joining us in this 2021 conference.
Sure. Contact information, you see my
Yes.
email and my Twitter handle there. Write it down, take a picture of it should you so desire. Feel free to reach out to me. I'd love to hear from you, and enjoy the next session.
And we apologize.